What is up, guys? Welcome back to another video. And in today's video, I want to talk to you about a very specific topic that a huge amount of people who come to me and that I work with struggle with. And that is hip impingement or pinchy hips. That feeling of, particularly when people flex their hip in this position, or when they squat deep or do any kind of movements like this in the gym or in their day-to-day life, they get a pinching in the front of their hip. And so many people who I've had conversations with and who have come to work with me in a one-to-one setting have either not found a solution or they've been led down the road of surgery for their hip impingement, and that just leads to more and more issues down the line. I get a ton of people who come to me after hip impingement surgery and they still have the same issues happening even though they've had the surgery. It's just provided a temporary fix, a temporary solution, but they're back in the same cycle. And for me, in my experience, hip impingement is something that can be resolved quite easily, but it oftentimes requires that we don't look at the hip, okay? There are elements of a hip impingement that are being caused by restrictions at the hip, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. But what I look at with someone who is dealing with a hip impingement or that pinchiness and restriction in the front of their hip is, number one, we look downstream at what their foot is doing. And then number two, we look at how that's interacting and impacting what's happening at the hip, because your foot pressures and your ability to access your back chain is absolutely huge for resolving hip impingement issues, and it's an area that's so often missed and overlooked in traditional rehab. And let me explain why this is so important. In a hip impingement, generally what I see with people at the hip level is that they will have a restriction in their posterior hip. Okay, they're compressed through their back chain and particularly this posterior pelvis, and they think of the area where all your glute tissues are, okay? This is the area of our hip where we have all this space to move into so that we can then move out of that space. So number one is the compression in the back of the hip, and that's the one thing that we need to restore. Now, why the foot becomes so important in that and why our foot pressures are so important in that is because if you put your attention and focus to your feet and what's happening at your foot, okay, we can take one at a time or we can go with both. But what I want you to feel is, if we take our right foot out in front, if I send the pressure towards the inside medial side, if I take and send my pressure and body weight towards the inside of my foot and start to lose the pressure and contact with my outside edge, so essentially I'm rolling off my foot, and then from here, if I try and flex my hip, okay, if I try sit back into a hinge, what you're gonna find is that that feels very pinchy here at the front, okay? It feels a little bit nasty in the adductors, the groins, and particularly here at the front of this hip, okay? If I kind of try flex my hip or hinge and lose the contact with that outside edge, nasty things start to happen. Now, if we can start to restore stronger foot shape and start to restore that ability to pressurize through the lateral arch of our foot, that outside edge, and now I sit down into my hip, what you'll feel, or what you should feel, is that the pressure starts to move up this back chain here into the back of your hip, and it starts to decompress this area at the back. And if we just take it back for a moment and look at why compression in our posterior hip can lead to issues like a hip impingement. So if we get compression in the back of our hip, okay, if I start to become compressed from my lifestyle, sedentary lifestyle, from poor movement habits, etc., this area becomes compressed, okay? What that does, if we imagine we've got our femur bone, which is the ball part of our hip joint, and we've got our pelvis, which is, let's call it the socket part of our hip joint. If I become compressed here in the back of my hip, what that does is it starts to push my femur forward in the socket and closes off this space here at the back. So when I go to flex my hip, my femur now can no longer glide back as it flexes to create that space and leverage at the front for my hip to flex smoothly and move nice and fluidly into that knee raised position, or similarly if I'm sitting down into a squat. Okay, we need to flex cleanly. We need to be able to glide back and move into all that space in the posterior part of our hip. But when that can't happen because of our compression that we got back here, what happens is I can't glide back anymore, and now this front side of my socket, the ball or the femur starts to come in contact with that part of the socket because it can't get that gliding motion happening in order to create that nice, clean, smooth motion within that hip joint. Okay, so that gliding is key, and it's one of the reasons why we experience that pinchiness. So that's the compression at the back of our hip. Now the second thing is with my foot pressure. If I have all that pressure on the inside edge of my foot and I can't pressurize my lateral side and keep that strong foot shape, what that does when I load into my leg, when I squat and we see this kind of squat, all that pressure gets sent up here along this inside line of tissue in our front chain, and that does not allow us to access the back. The key really is to unlock this backside, decompress this backside, which allows that gliding to happen like I was just speaking about, and that allows for a clean flexion, and it allows us to access the space in our back chain. So the task really is to start decompressing the back of your pelvis. And this is where I start with all my one-to-one clients who come to me with either a history of hip impingements or come through hip impingement type surgery. This is where we start, because this is generally where we see the restrictions. And we need to look and consider both the foot, and we need to look at the posterior part of our hip to decompress that back space. And so there are two really simple exercises that I use with my clients and that I'm going to share with you now in this video that you can start doing to, number one, start to restore the awareness and the pressurization of that lateral edge of your foot, and start to connect that with your hip and start to send that pressure and tension up that back chain so that you can start to unlock that space in your posterior pelvis to allow that clean hip flexion to start happening and that gliding to start happening within the hip joint. So here's exactly how you can set up and start doing these two exercises. This is our kickstand hinge with our banded E version. You're going to set up a band roughly at ground level here on a rack or some kind of upright post, and you're going to take it and wrap it around your outside foot around the ankle, okay, or just slightly above the ankle. From here we're going to step out, get tension on the band, and what we want to do here is resist. So just like in our reversion banded drill where we're trying to balance, what we want to do is resist that band, so we supinate that foot and keep that pressure on the outside edge of our foot. The band wants to pull us in and collapse our foot in onto the inside edge, but we're going to stay and resist that band, so I supinate everything out. From here now, we're going to get our kickstand position, slight bend in my knee. All my weight is on this standing leg. Back leg is nice and light. It's just here for some balance. And from here now, we're going to sit back into a hinge, keeping that weight and that knee dropped forward here, sitting back into the hip, and all the time focusing on that pressure and that resistance of the band. So keeping that pressure in the outside edge and all the time fighting that band for what it's wanting to do. It's wanting to pull us in. So we want to stay on the outside edge as we sit back into our hip, drive through the floor, and just keep this a very small and very controlled movement. My knee stays frozen, so it's a slight bend in the knee, stays frozen in space. I push my hip back and sit into that hip. Think of a karate chop at the hip, push through the floor, push through that outside edge, keep that knee where it is, and the hip comes back. Rep this nice and slowly, and again, all the time focusing the awareness on that foot pressure on the outside edge. So all the time, you're trying to resist that band pulling you in onto that inside edge of the foot. Floating heel hinge ISO with a wall reference. Going to set up with our backs to the wall, and you're going to set your feet about hip width apart here, okay? But we want feet pointing straight ahead. From here, what we're going to do is drop our knees forward. So we put a slight bend in the knees, and then I get my heels floating just a couple of inches off the floor. We want to keep our heels floating off the floor all the time throughout, okay? If we start to move back into our hinge here, and I feel my heels come in contact with the floor, it means that we are starting to shift that load back into the hamstrings, and we're starting to straighten those knees back. So your reference all the time on this is making sure your heels are constantly floating off the floor. As you hinge back here, as we're about to do, you'll feel that you want to drift back, but you want to keep those knees forward and stop those heels from hitting the floor. So feet straight ahead. We're going to set up with our backs to the wall. I'm just a couple of inches away from the wall here. You can play around with the distance yourself. From here, bending the knees, heels float, and we're going to maintain that. We want to maintain length in the spine all the time. So imagine nice and long reach through the top of the head, and I'm trying to reach that head and my sit bones away from each other. From here, we're going to take the hands, use the outer blades, and we're going to imagine a karate chop at our hips, okay? And we're going to use the hands here to actually help push our hips back. And what we want to do is try find the wall with our hips. So I keep pushing back. The knees can bend if I want here, but keep the heels floating. And we find the wall, okay? We're not relying on the wall in that we rest on it. We're just feeling that contact and that reference. From here now, what I want you to do is take your hands and imagine lifting your sit bones and sliding them up the wall just a little bit more, while still keeping those heels floating on the floor. That should put some nice tension and load here into the back of the hips. And from here, we're just going to hold and breathe, okay? Keeping that tension in the hips, keeping the heels floating. The next thing we want to focus on is I drive my feet, so the balls of my feet, in contact with the floor. I'm actively trying to smash them into the floor, okay? So it's an isometric, but the intent is to drive through the floor with my feet while holding here and breathing. From here, we have two positions we can play around with. We can do holds with our knees in this more open position, and then we switch and we internally rotate a little bit more so it opens out the back of this pelvis, and we do that by rotating our knees inwards ever so slightly to get them pointing forward a little bit more. Third and final variation is that we can hold here and move in and out of this position. So I'm just pivoting on the balls of my feet, heels are still floating, and I'm just moving those knees, drawing little small semicircles. The knees are out and then they're in, and feel how that pressure changes and moves around in the hip, okay? All right, guys, so there are your two exercises that you can start doing right now to start correcting that pinchy sensation and impingement that you're getting in your hips. Couple of closing thoughts on this subject, okay? And to summarize what we've talked about, two key areas you need to work on if you're suffering with pinchy hips in this kind of motion are, number one, restoring pressure in the outside edge of your foot and that lateral arch, and then secondly, decompressing the back of your pelvis, because we need both of those things separately and to start working together in order to be able to load our hips correctly in movement and reteach that ability of our hip to start gliding and moving into that back space. So that's essential, and now you have two key exercises that you can start doing right now to be able to make that happen and start making progress and resolving those hip issues. Both these exercises that I've shared with you, I've taken from our hip mobility program and our foot and ankle fascia program, where we focus heavily on that foot to hip connection and the decompression of the posterior part of our pelvis and hip so that we can restore that back chain dominance, because that's really the key. When we get pushed into our front chain, we get a lot of compression in the system and we get a lot of achy, creaking, pinchy joints that don't feel like they can move and glide smoothly. So make sure you check those out in the description below if you want to find out more about how you can go through a step-by-step progressive process with each of those programs. Also, drop a comment below, let me know if you found this video helpful and you'd like to see more videos like this in the future to help you with specific issues that you may be struggling to resolve. That's it for this one, guys. I'll see you in the next video.